Good evening. Good evening. It's 6:05 on April 10th, and I'd like to call the April 10th meeting of the Ag Advisory to order.
Well, there he is.
Yes. Oh.
Come to order again.
And I'd like to hand this off now.
Okay. Good job, Natalie, though.
All right, I'm gonna have Lauren here, so. Move on that.
I don't think she's here.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Sometimes she does it for me, the whole world.
Oh,
So, all right, is James Oku present? Natalie Sayre,
Here.
I am here. Peter,
Here.
Brian Casey, here. Jonathan Winslow,
Here.
Lauren's not here, and we've got a bunch of vacant positions. Jim Howard, you make it? He doesn't watch these, so he won't be offended. Corin Whittle,
Here.
Jess Brown here, and usually Frank.
And he's no longer
Oh,
the
okay.
director.
Do we have a new director? Or we
There's an
looking for one?
interim, Igor Lynn. Yeah,
Okay. And since you called it to order, I assume that we have, that is enough for a quorum.
Yes, that is a forum.
So. Not a huge agenda tonight, but we do have agenda item 3, oral communications, which allow the public to address the committee on any matter not on the agenda. If your subject is not on the agenda, the chair will recognize you at this time.
And I just want to mention, we do have, this meeting is hybrid for public participation. So I do have some members online remotely. So I'll monitor that. And there is one raised hand online. So whenever you're ready, just let me know.
Yeah, let's go to that raised hand.
Yeah, okay.
John, on the next one.
Okay, sorry, I didn't see.
Audrea, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm sorry I've missed the last few meetings. They've always aligned with being out of town, unfortunately. But I wanted to say, I think a lot of you know this, but I've actually moved into a new position at the RCD, and there's a new ag program manager. And I think she's in the room, and she's also our new agricultural ombudsman. So I just wanted to introduce Eliza to you all. Maybe Eliza can talk now and introduce herself.
thanks, Audrea. Yeah, hi, everyone. I'm Eliza. I have some background farming in Santa Cruz and Healdsburg in the last like 10 or so years. And I just joined the RC in March. So I'm going to be the program manager for the agricultural program and then also serving as the county ombudsman. So hopefully I'll get to meet you all over the coming days.
Welcome.
Thank you.
All right, Dante.
Sure. I want to talk water, ag water, not your stuff.
Okay.
Post owns, as you guys know, from the Gazo's Creek all the way to the Pescadero Post Office, Green Hollow, big swath of land. And they also control a lot of the water, like the Center Water Mutual Company, a lot of companies. And Mid-Penn is going to be purchasing a lot of that land. And they've done several presentations. Yeah, I think it was back in December. Mid-Penn showed a real nice map that shows some of the prime soils, the water system, and they're very clear that they don't want their shares of the water system. We've heard them say that several times at these meetings. And while Post still owns all of that land, that big swath of land, I'd like to encourage them to write in some utility easements. If there's ever a day when that water can be brought to these other properties, whether it's your guys' property, key component of prime soils is water. And there's a lot of prime soils out there that does not have water. It's not part of the water company. So whether it's in Pescadero, R&R off of Bean Hollow, and some of the lands that they own above the nursery, I see on that map that Penn showed, is actually farmable ground, possibly prime soils with shares to this water system. And Post is always clear, Mid-Penn is clear that it's easier for Post to do the work that they're doing for Mid-Penn before a public agency takes it over. So now's our time to encourage them to write this in. If there's ever a day, my concern is Mid-Penn's very clear that they don't want their water shares. And I don't see how the water company is going to survive financially when they give up those shares. Therefore, if you were able to sell those, it's 1,000 acre feet. I believe that water system, if it's in the day, I was told it's 1,000 acre feet. It lies within the boundaries of the swath of land that they own, which some of it might have sold in over the years. But anyway, now's the time, while it's still owned by a private entity, Post, to encourage them. I know there's been several presentations that have come by Mid-Penn and others, and I don't know if this ship's already sailed and it's too late, but it's never, just to mention this to them now, to again, write in these utility easements with today's pumps, PG&E, VFD, it's not a big deal to move water. That system, old in its day, had flumes and ditches and other things, as Peter and Gene, we all know, most of us know. But again, it's a time to speak up. We're trying to get people off the creeks. Who knows what the future is going to hold. And again, for this system to survive, they're going to need to sell some of that water. I just don't see their Post or Mid-Penn has been very clear about giving up their share. I've heard it at several meetings. That's the same with Pescadero came up again the other day. So I keep singing this same tune. People are listening. Nothing's happening. And I figured I would try this crowd here and see, if you. I know you're advisory to, I guess, the board of supervisors of the county, but yeah, this is ag, and if there's a chance that they come back, or if anybody from Mid-Penn's here now or Post, mention that.
How is the water system financed? Each user will pay based on
So
the acre.
Peter
feet
could
they
probably
have
speak on that,
access
but there's shares that they all have that they pay into, and a big portion of that, I believe, is paid, or a portion of that is paid by Post, and they don't use those shares. Do you mind speaking on that, Pete?
The way I understand, Post pays, we all pay according to our shares for the water. That we own the water rights. And if Post bows out, like Dante said, that's gonna put that much more onto the farmer, the other shares. The other thing too, is these meetings that Mid-Penn's been having, as a major shareholder of Lake Lucerne, they never notified me. I only found out from Dante, and I should be notified and all this here. And in the past, when I say we, it's me, my brother, our family, and some investors in Santa Cruz own 12 parcels, we had a survey for the right for the pipeline to go from one parcel to another. We presented to Post a long time ago. I said that was maps and all this here, and they didn't want to bother with it. So they're not, like Dante said, doing their due diligence to bring it all up like they should. And if Mid-Penn takes it over, I'm worried that they're going to do like when the state blocked Ardini's branch and just took it all out of production. And speaking about the production, it's funny, I brought this here. This was our ranch that Dad started farming, my grandfather in 1952, and when Post acquired the property, they took the water rights out of production, and so you'll never see Brussels sprouts again because it takes water, and so I fear and feel the same thing's going to happen through the Peninsula Farms. With all that, like Don just said, 1,000 acre foot of watershed and all this here, that, by, it's going to economically squeeze us out.
And some of the other property out there as well, the Stern Ranch was transferred to the state. Those shares went back to lost revenue to the system. So there's water, we don't have farmers, we're losing the ground. And yes, the shareholders would have to agree on this. They have to sell shares, bylaws, like that, whatever. All I'm saying is to get them to write in these utility easements now would be huge. Trying to deal with a public agency someday. Good luck.
As
But Post owns it right now. They're private.
and like Don brought up a lot of good points. One of the ranches that we farmed years ago that's referred to where Post owns now, where Gordon lives, it used to be Hackey's and Yankee Goat, or other known as the pheasant club area. I said that there, when Post sold that property to the state, they took the water rights out from perpetuity and that they could never be farmed again. And one time when I stated this at a farm bill meeting with Dan Holstein there, Dan said from Post, Dan said, Peter, you show me? Yeah, call me. I said, well, I'm a little busy, but call. So we met a few months later and I showed him. He researched it out. You know, you're right. I said, oh, because we lived it. And so what I'm trying to say is they took out, like I said, a lot of agricultural production where the water is right there, the pump's there, the infrastructure's there, the pipeline's there, the valve's there. It's the same pump that was used to irrigate the south end of the pheasant club. You just turn one valve to the other, and like I said, there's a deal, and now it's full of pampas grass, and they made a deal with the state. So what I'm trying to say is, I'm backing up what Dante's saying is, I think we're going to be pushed out. And here, when Post first acquired that property, I remember when my father had suggestions to Walter Moore, his answer was, we own the majority of the watershed. We're going to do water rights. We're going to do what we want to do. And so, well, if they're going to keep doing what they want to do, like say this, look at it now. We'll never have this again. Agriculture and have office grass, weeds, and rattlesnakes. So.
And Post is in the driver's seat now. They own it. They've done a lot for ag, do a lot more. But I don't think it's really going beyond the room. I bring this stuff up, so I'm hoping that the ag board or the committee could possibly write something.
I guess I'd like to see if I can understand, like there's utility easements, certain people are paying to use the water right now, right? But there's not as much farming that's happening as there once was. So without those farmers, how do we get money into the water system? We just make sure that the access to water for each parcel is maintained and written clearly about, so that it's a possibility that future farmers can pay into.
Let me give you an
Let's just
example.
say,
Excuse me. I'll give you an example. This is, we currently own 7 parcels right now, me and my brother and my wife.
And up off of being all of there.
Yeah, that from the that we pump out of Lake Lucerne.
Mhm.
And to keep that going, our share with our water right with those 7 parcels was $19,000. If Post bows out, it'll easily be double.
Yeah. And is that regardless of whether you're using the water?
Regardless if you use it or not,
Yeah.
if you were to maintain your water rights.
Mhm.
And so like I say, so if Post bows out, it'd probably be triple, because they're paying a certain amount to keep between having the license of those reservoirs to keep it up in the state compliance with the valves of the middle reservoir, to keep it in compliance and all this here, where we want it to have it, that we could have a siphon like I used to. The state, no, we can't have it, all that there, and Joe Musa takes care of all that there. But anyways, so this is, see, Dante brought all this up, you know, I'm adding what I know.
Yeah.
And so that would be currently one of the parts, 2 of the parcels that we farmed for 20 years. And the Post acquired that we used to rip from them. And they're in the Williamson Act, and the last time we farmed it was 2019. It's been fallow, and the stage rushes kept it was moving.
let's just say there's a day, whether it's R&R or you guys or others lose those water rights to Pescadero Creek or Butte Mill. And right now you have this contiguous land to 1,000 acres that's right in this utility easement. Even though there'd have to be a day, you'd have to buy shares if the shareholders were willing to sell, which that day very well come, whether Midpen or Post sells them, or it goes back to the system and the majority of the shareholders sell them. All I'm saying is to just, this deal was written in to this transfer to Midpen. It's not like it's gonna be a deal breaker. And, Midpen, but again, how do we get to whether it goes to the Midpen board, whether the final say is here? It's all about, they removed the utility grid. I've been watching PG&E out there at Hidden Valley. They took down all that high voltage power. There used to be homes by the barn, infrastructure, early days of Post. Not impossible to put it back, but what it takes to put in primary PG&E power now these days to run those pumps. Again, all doable, or you have propane or diesel, although with the clean air stuff, you probably have to go all electric. Just, they've done a lot for ag, but we've got to really be careful here. Right in these utility easements would be huge.
Who is the water system? What is the entity?
Lake Lucerne Mutual Water Company? is that what it is?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I had worked for the property owner and old Coastside family prior to the sale to Post. And there are some beautiful old maps, the Peninsula Farm subdivision, the hand-drawn maps that are recorded that show even the designated reservoir sites, the small ponds that we do have that serve individual parcels. And there was also information regarding the water rights as it applies, to water storage with the state. This was a big deal when this initially was sold to Post. It was the largest land deal in Northern California price-wise, and when people asked me, well, how could this farmland sell for so much? And I said, well, it was because of the water. To me, the water was such a critical, amazing resource for our area, and it was for the agricultural purposes. That's how Peninsula Farms was actually created, with basically, for the most part, 40-acre parcels. And so, yeah, this will be a departure, and I think it is important to pay attention and see if there's some ways that there's an opportunity that the whole system won't be borne by just a few people, because it can't be sustained that way, or even in certain ways maintaining waterhead, depending on where you are on the system and everything else. So Dante brought up a good point.
If we were to see that map, I'm sure we can get access to it. I mean, it's so crystal clear on the map. Green Hollow, Highway 1, Gazgo's, Cloverdale, the Pescadero Post Office. That's contiguous land, that swath of land. Just to have those utility easements written in with today's pumps, you can move water very easily.
Yeah, and there's an incredible amount of water in the Hidden Valley above Lake Lucerne, those two lakes up there that feed Lake Lucerne. And that's an incredible watershed that filled up in no time. The first storm filled everything up, right, Dante? It was overflowing down below. So, and here you have, if you come over the top of that hill, you have Fifth Crow, you have
Right there.
and we have the RCD trying to work hard on creating off-stream impoundments to stop and allow Butte Creek to survive and possibly coho and steal it to get back in the flying grounds. Same thing holds true for Pescadero and San Gregorio. And I think that the RCD so far has done a great job in working on this kind of a thing. And I can see this as being a future, and, not letting that water go. It's there. And it could solve a lot of problems. Here we are trying to filter crummy wells they're full of iron, manganese, hydrogen sulfide, salts, and everything else. And when we have good surface water that we could collect and store, and as long as we have the amount of water that we need for a season, calculate it, and distribute it that way, that seems to me future.
The reservoir just filled up like that in the storms, as we all know, in millions of gallons a day flowing to the ocean. That's such a huge watershed back there in Hidden Valley. It's just a need for more bigger mega reservoirs, floodplain retention basins, but that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
I just want to say, echo on what Steve said, real quick, like VJ Burns always brings up, like Steve was saying, the watershed on the Hidden Valley. If there was build one more reservoir on
Oh,
the
yeah.
upper part,
Oh.
it could probably
Oh,
take care of all the other farms
Yeah, Race Bean Hollow Road.
and,
But they-
yeah,
so
they
that's
take
what
care
my
of-
dad wanted to do in the fifties. He was with the Corps of Engineers. He
and,
proposed taking Bean Hollow Road straight across. And backing that up into all the sagebrush, there's nothing up there, they're backed all the way up and we have water forever, you know?
Can you answer your question, John?
I think so. I mean, there are existing utilities up there for the established parcels. What you're saying is that we need to have that written in before the land transfer happens and have the possibility of new utilities being created when those current users sell theirs to, because like I'm not connected, you know, as much as I'm contiguous with it, there's new pipelines that are gonna have to be made.
So
And
that's
those may
what,
have to be made through Mid-Penn land
Yes,
after the transfer of ownership.
that's exactly where I'm going. There's actual no physical, just, they have this written in utility, but let's just say the day comes, yeah, great, you're selling shares, okay. R&R, fifth row, root down, where, boom, 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 we're all in the Bible. Well, no, how are we gonna run that pipe through a public agency, public land, say, oh, no, it was written into the deal before post-transfer, it's in place, boom, this is great. It might sit on idle for years, but it's there.
Yeah.
It's done all the time, not unheard of.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Is this something the committee wants to address? Or continue
Farm
talking
Bureau.
about as a committee? And
Yeah, maybe we should try to agendize it and then we can write a little letter. We're so good at that.
there you go.
Takes Lauren a couple, 3 months. And it will. Yeah, but maybe we can lean on Peter and Dante for some help with how we'd want to draft a suggestion to the Board of Supervisors on that. Because I think it would be a way to build in some resiliency. You know, we are working with the RCD to build small ponds that have to, you know, we have to pump from the creek in the winter time to fill them, and then they're just enough for that 1 year. And to be able to take advantage of these existing very large ponds.
Right.
Say the creek doesn't have any water in it, I can't fill my little pond. Where, you know, but we might still have a couple hundred acre feet.
And part of it is this funding that's funding that now with these forbearance agreements. I think that that money could be shifted towards, okay, we're gonna, yeah, farther off the creek and more towards that water system. We get 1,000 acre feet. When these ponds are all drying up during the drought, there's a lot of water up there in that system. It's a hidden gem.
John, I have one other item.
Yes,
For those of you that weren't at Farm Bureau on last Monday night, Mid-Penn made a presentation on the agricultural policies that they want to add to their management plan they have for the coast side since annexing. It was, you know, it's really important. You can go to their website. And this is a prime example of something that needs to be more thoroughly addressed in their policies that are more generic and more leaning towards their, rightfully so, their mission is, resource protection and recreation, but they're trying to incorporate ag policies, but this is, a prime example of you need to, if you're taking on acquiring new property, it cannot compromise existing or potential ag operations. So that's something that I really need to look at. And then Mid-Penn will be having a Zoom meeting on Wednesday night. And on their agenda, there is more acquisition for South Powell. So again, there's more and more ownership by public entities, but that does have, it changes the complexion and the management style and maybe their overall intent than private ownership where people look for different types of land utilities. So it's worth looking into those agricultural policies and writing in if you're so desired to have your thoughts known. And I think because they're such a major, and they are a public agency, and so I think attending those board meetings on Zoom And giving them your input is really important, and I think that it'd be good for them to hear some of the farmers' points of view.
If I may, through the chair. Just going off of what Carrie is mentioning, the Midpen did recently reach out. And I haven't had a chance to run it by you, Chair Vars, but Midpen has reached out to request being agendized on the May 8th Ag Advisory Committee meeting to come and provide a presentation on the draft ag policy and discuss and receive feedback from the Ag Advisory Committee as well.
Great. All right, anything else from, not, I guess, from members of the public before we move on?
One last thing,
Yeah,
there is a clock ticking here, and I don't know as far as Midcan taking over that post property. You know, I know they mentioned it, some of the pesky there on that meeting.
What kind of time restrictions are you
I think
on?
we're really, really close when they were talking here, so I hope we're not too late. So
How can we find
Yeah.
that out?
I mean, my understanding is that, and maybe the county knows better, but I don't believe that the ability to adjust lot lines has been finalized. So until that happens, there can't actually be a transfer of ownership. But I know Post is really working.
And there is a meeting Wednesday night on Zoom, and you can, on oral communications, just like now, you can at least bring up the topic that you'd like it explored more.
I'm in 200 meetings, kind of how it's gonna work, so I won't be.
Pretty self-closed.
On Wednesday night, there's a mid-10 meeting, you're saying?
7 o'clock.
Yeah, but I don't have that information on the timeline. Worth reaching out to some of the folks. All right, so anything from community members, committee members that is to share news or concerns for items not on the agenda?
I have
Always count on.
a couple. Don't shoot the messenger here. Minimum wage increase as of April 1st. Hopefully everyone is aware of it. So that's for all the unincorporated.
14 now, right?
1650 for all the unincorporated San Mateo County. And so it doesn't matter the size of the business. We do certified producer certificates. This is for the growers in the room. And so there's a new database through California Department of Food and Agriculture, and it's taking a while to shift all that information over to the new database. So we just need 2 weeks before your certificate expires. You guys are smiling. It's already happening. So right now, okay, all right. And then there's a weed that we're trying to address. It was being sold as a cut flower for a bit, but it's actually a noxious weed. It's called pokeweed. And so we've been working with the farmers that were growing it. And also we found some spots where people probably planted it. We're not sure if it's actually going into the natural area and spreading more. So we're trying to address the pokeweed right now before it gets too far removed from us being able to eradicate it.
Picture of it?
You know what,
I guess we can Google it.
yeah.
Okay,
that
you're gonna say that.
So I probably can bring one up eventually here.
Is that its?
So there's Mexican pokeweed. So the American pokeweed is not, it's, I think the Mexican one is not rated, but the Mexican pokeweed is A-rated, which is the one that we're always trying to attack. So we can't let A-rated plants be sold. And it never was, we didn't really know it was being sold commercially until we started spreading, like we tested it. And then but there's another one that's Q-rated, and this is kind of inside baseball, I guess. Yeah, so Q-rated is, they're not quite sure if how detrimental it is.
Is it
Thank
edible?
you.
No, the berries are actually
think they're
poisonous.
really-
Yeah. Well, actually, since we've kind of gone into this, we've discovered all sorts of things about pokeweed. They would make pokeweed salad, like it has like a history, so I don't, it's kind of interesting.
So it's
But it is
edible?
poisonous.
Did-
No, you have to like, you have to cook it a certain way. I don't know. Don't go off what I say. Don't try to eat it, anyone.
Any around Pescadero that you know
No, it's been up and we found it first in San Bruno, and then it's been, we found it in Montero area.
of?
Well, I don't know, it could be birds too, I don't know. But we're just kind of trying to make everyone aware that, don't plant it. And definitely, and don't sell it. It's obnoxious weed, so. Those are my announcements.
Thank you, Commissioner Whittle. Anybody else from our committee?
I had something, I was talking to Summer earlier about the director's report and the list of items on there and how that works. If everything on the director's report will come up in front of the AAC, or if in fact there's some things that won't, and what exactly, the reasoning behind that. And Summer, you mentioned that you might just quickly go over that. Is that okay?
Yes, sure. If you'd like, I can do that now. Yeah, with regards to the director's report, it's broken up into sections. So we report on PAD permits that have already come to the Ag Advisory Committee and report on their outcomes once they go to either the Planning Commission or Board of Supervisors. So we report those for the previous month. We also report new planned agricultural district applications. That's the second section of the director's report. Those are new applications that have come in the last 30 days since our last meeting, and would be coming to the Ag Advisory Committee at some point in the future when they are ready to hit that milestone. And then we report on coastal development permit exemptions for agricultural projects. So projects in PAD zoned areas, but that are of a nature and meet certain criteria that could qualify for a coastal development exemption. And those are more or less over-the-counter type of permits that we process. They're actually not permits, they're exemptions that we process. And so we report on those. And then we have the last section is other projects. And so that category includes projects that are in PAD, on PAD zone property, but perhaps because of the scope of work may not trigger a PAD permit. It might just be a coastal development permit or some other type of permit. Or it could be projects that do require coming to the AAC, however, may not have a PAD permit associated with it, such as in the director's report for tonight, there's one item in other projects that does not require a PAD permit, so wouldn't be put into that second category of the director's report, but is listed as another project and is for a new Williamson Act contract. And so that is required to go before the Ag Advisory Committee. So that would be coming forward to the committee at some point in the future, but is listed as an other project. Simply for the purpose that it does not have a specific PAD permit associated with it. So these are the categories that we have in the director's report. And if it is confusing, I can certainly accommodate, reporting in a different style, or perhaps just identifying under each category, particularly the other projects category, which permits that are listed would actually come before the AAC in the future versus which would not require an AAC recommendation, to make that a little more clear in what you're looking at.
Makes sense to me.
So perhaps adding for each one, just adding whether it will require an AAC recommendation or not, if that makes sense and
So you
would
just
help
delineate-
clarify.
You just delineate that in the report.
Right, under each permit. Yeah, we just add that into each listed permit.
Yeah, and see if the committee's okay with that.
Yeah, I think
It'd be helpful.
I appreciate knowing if this is like the only time we're gonna see information on it.
Or if
Sure.
the committee needs a recommendation. Yeah. I
Sure.
appreciate you
Yeah.
offering it.
Yeah, we can definitely do that.
Thank you.
Hey.
Oh, Summer, did the appointments for the vacancies get filled for the Ag Commission? I noticed they weren't listed as vacancies anymore. I
Yeah,
know-
they are taken down from the boards and commissions. So they are not open vacancy recruitments, and they are with the Board of Supervisors. The applications are with the Board of Supervisors for review and consideration and interview. So I don't know what the exact current status is, but I do know they have been passed over and are under review.
Thank you.
So hopefully that's coming, to a close. And we'll get some new committee members in here soon.
Okay, so it looks like our regular agenda item, item number 6 is an informational item, and I think we're lucky to have Greg Smith with us, the Water and Protection and Land Use Program Supervisor from the county's Environmental Health Services. And he's going to present on water well regulations.
Yes, and Greg, you want me to just go ahead and share?
Sure, go ahead
screen?
and pop it up. I don't know how lucky you are, but I'm the lucky one. here.
Let me,
Everybody. I know most of you or have met you at one point or another. As he said, Greg Smith or Smitty works fine. Supervise all the water protection and land use programs for environmental health. I've been doing that since January 2007. I've been with the county for 24 and a half years now. Came way back into the remediation programs as a professional geologist that they needed to help them comply with business and professions codes for cleanup of soil and groundwater contaminated sites. And I came there from 10 years as an environmental consultant doing those characterizations and cleanups, and at the same time serving some of my clients on some of their other needs for supply wells at some places like landfills where they needed dust suppression, and so wells was the way to go. I was asked to talk about wells. I didn't get real, any feedback on exactly what you guys want to know about them, but feel free to come in with questions whenever you want. And if it's something that I have later in the slides, I'll just put you off until later. Yeah, Peter,
The sanitary seal.
I'll get to that, I promise.
He needs to ask questions.
I'll get to that. Go ahead and move one forward, please.
Mhm.
We do still have dug wells in this county. And dug wells, not too many, but we do still come across them. So you're that little idyllic thing with the gnomes, going around the wells. We do still see them and try to get those removed. In fact, we just took one out on North Street
Yeah.
about, was that 10 years ago, 8 years ago? For Rocha?
Yeah. Mhm.
And try and get them replaced with good wells. Go ahead and move forward, please. So, different types of wells that we deal with, and San Mateo County is the sole well permitting agency, environmental health, the sole well permitting agency throughout the county. For many, many years, City of Daly City did their own, but when Patrick Sweetland retired, he finally gave that up. He was the head of their public works and wanted to hold it near and dear. We do permit a whole slew of types of wells, most of which you aren't going to be dealing with. Number one for you guys is likely irrigation or agricultural supply wells. We try to kind of make a distinction between true ag supply wells versus irrigation at, say, a single family home or an estate in Hillsborough. That's actually where most of the wells are going in, is Hillsborough, Atherton, all those places where they want a well to irrigate their property. We do domestic supply wells, and by that I mean a well that's going to serve from 1 to 4 service connections, and that falls simply under our county wells ordinance for just like the ag wells for regulation. We do public supply wells for public water system. Public water systems are going to be anything that, in this case, are regulated by the State Water Resources Control Board, Division of Drinking Water. That's going to be for either community or non-community, non-transient or non-community transient systems. A lot of you, I know, Peter, you have a community system because you serve 25 or more of the same people at least 6 weeks out of the year. So you become a community water system in that case. So a public water system, we permit the well installation and then we hand it off to the state to work through all the rest of the permitting on that for the pump tests and everything else. Also springs and horizontal wells, if they're going to be used for domestic use, which we do still have some of that out there. We don't worry about it if it is for ag use. But it does get mentioned in our wells ordinance, mainly just for permitting it as a potable domestic source. Other types of wells that we permit, you guys really aren't going to deal with much. Cathodic protection wells or sacrificial anodes to protect typically subsurface utilities, metal fuel tanks or pipelines. PG&E is our biggest one there for all of the sacrificial anodes, so that the anode degrades and the pipeline doesn't rust. We do groundwater monitoring wells and piezometers. Piezometers meaning a groundwater monitoring well just to look at the water level, the groundwater level. Ground source heat exchange wells, we have a lot of that going in Woodside and other places where they're getting their heating and cooling just by having a ground source loop. Typically at least 300 feet deep and maybe several of those to get the heat exchange they want. And then other geotechnical or sensing wells like inclinometers and that kind of stuff. And we get a lot of that through USGS or some of those folks. So anytime you're going to be drilling a hole in the ground like that, we get involved, and it's for public health and protection, because every time you drill a hole, that's a potential conduit to the subsurface for contaminants. And that's what we're trying to cut off.
What depth do you guys kick in, meaning?
So on the bay side, as soon as you hit groundwater, or 10 feet or more. So sometimes groundwater is at 3 or 4 feet. If you're hitting groundwater when you're drilling, we get involved. Otherwise, as soon as you go 10 feet or more. Yep. Go ahead and next slide. So most of what you guys are used to seeing when a well is going in is something that looks like that. This is a mud rotary rig. Most of the drilling in this county is mud rotary. So you probably see in either Aaron from Earthflow, or you see in Wilkinson, or maybe you see in Majora. And they're going to be running mud rotary rigs out here. And that's either for the ag wells or the domestic wells. If you're looking at monitoring wells, different style of drilling, typically shallower. It's going to be this solid flat auger, hollow stem auger, because they want to sample a lot more as they're going down. It has to be discrete samples. But mud rotary is mostly what you're going to see. Go ahead and next slide. And then what you're going to see when it's all done is this little bit of the surface. So a lot of people, all they know is, oh, that's a well. But there's a lot more to it than that in the subsurface. Good diagram, bad construction, just because that's not tall enough. I can talk about that a little bit later when it comes to actual well construction, but the whole idea of a well pad and the top plate and the surface seal here on a well is to exclude water, especially with the flooding we had. One of the first things that I did was go out with somebody from Office of Emergency Services into Pescadero to go around to the different folks that I knew had domestic wells to make sure to see if their wells had been inundated by the flooding. So when you have your wells, you want to maintain the wellhead. Go ahead and next slide. So instead of that, what you really get is everything that's below in the ground. Now, some of you know more than others about wells. When we're drilling the wells, when we get that rig out there, we drill the well from the top down. We get to our target depth or where the driller is finding good water production. And then we decide from that how they're going to build the well. So you drill it from the top down, you build it from the bottom to the top. So when they're actually looking at how they're going to construct that well, they're thinking, okay, how much pipe am I going to be putting in? How much of that is going to be perforated pipe? And then how much am I going to need blank on top of that, or solid pipe? So you're going to be putting the pipe in, usually with centralizers to keep that in the middle of the hole. And you want to keep it in the middle of the hole because if it's laying up against one side, when you go to pour, either put your sand pack in, or I'll explain a little bit more about that, or when you get to put in the seal, if that's laying up against the sidewall of the boring, then you're not going to get a seal, and that's a vertical conduit potential right there for contaminants to go from the surface down. So we want to look at casing in the middle, so a larger boring, smaller casing in the hole, perforations, and then the blank up to above the surface. They're going to come in typically, and they're going to put a sand pack in place. And that sand pack, or a filter pack, and it really is meant to be a filter. Once the well goes in, you've got earth materials that are here. Said earlier that it's mud rotary. The mud that they're talking about is they're circulating mud down through the drill string and out where the cutter head is, out where they're actually the tip of the drill bit is. And that mud under pressure that they're pumping it in then lifts back up all of the cuttings, all of the native material that they're taking out, and that comes out at the surface. So when you're drilling down, it's the cutter head and it's the mud that they're pumping in that's actually bringing up all of the sediments that they're drilling through. So you've got your native materials, you've got a saturated zone typically of, that's the water that you want to get to. You have your casing in, you have a sand pack, and the sand pack is going to act as a filter so that it'll hold back the native material. And over time, that sand pack, you'll get some of the native material coming in. That will act as a filter to keep too much fine grain from coming into the well and making your pump work harder because it's trying to pump sediments. So the sand pack does serve a purpose. to filter out a lot of the fines. And then above the sand pack and above that perf level, we're going to seal off from there to the surface so that we have a way to, so that we're not getting a vertical conduit down. Now, you asked about sanitary seal. The depth of the sanitary seal, and that's a cement seal, typically a sand cement mixture. Sand cement mixture for a concrete, basically, that's sand based. That is going to be our sanitary seal. That's what we look at as that seal to keep things from the surface impacting at depth. Okay. When we look at the different constructions, we look at different constructions for different types of wells based on the potential risk that could be posed. You've asked about sanitary seal. The bare minimum sanitary seal that's listed in the state well standards and listed in our county standards is a 20-foot sanitary seal, 20 feet before you get to anything where it's going to be perfed or sandpacked. Now that's a minimum. And that's great for ag wells, especially when you have shallower water that you're going after. But it's not real great for a domestic well. Because the higher the risk, in other words, if you're drinking it, now you want to be a little bit more protective. You probably want a deeper seal to protect it from any surficial contaminants. We still go 20 foot as the basic, and that's what you were asking about. When we're looking at a single family domestic well, say in an area of Moss Beach or Montera that's not served by public water, we're looking at 50 feet for a sanitary seal. And we talk about it as looking for a 50-foot seal in an urbanized area, because we also have sewers to protect against. We have a whole bunch of other potential contaminating factors we want to protect against. It's not, the 50 feet is not written into the current ordinance, but hopefully I'll get to rewrite that ordinance before I retire in a couple of years. It's the last one of my ordinances I haven't rewritten, and we're going to try to write that piece in. Now, if you have a well that is being used for public water system, there's a whole other set of rules that come into play from the state waterworks standards. And that's a combination of several different state titles or code of regulations that talk about water systems. Very specifically, when we look at the annular seal in the annular space is going to be, you're looking straight down on it. Here's the boring that we drill. That's the hole, the boring or hole in the ground that we drill. And then we put the well casing inside of that. Well, for any normal well, minimum here is 2 inch. So if we're going to put in a 5-inch casing, we need at least a 9-inch boring, right? Because we have to have 2 inches all the way around. Again, to make sure that we're getting an adequate seal so that we don't have vertical contaminants, vertical transportation of contaminants. If you're looking at a well for a public water system, they require the 50-foot depth minimum. And instead of 2 inches, it has to be 3 inches of annular space. So if you want a 5-inch casing, then all of a sudden you've got to get an 11-inch diameter boring. And again, higher risk because theoretically for a public supply well, you're serving more people. If something goes wrong with your source, then you're affecting more people. That's the way any kind of drinking water works down from US EPA, is the higher the potential risk, the higher the number, more people that could be affected by it, the more it's regulated and monitored. So different construction by risk of contamination. Yeah, Dante.
Earlier wells were old steel case, and then the newer plastic. But I see the new municipality well, like CSA 11, they went back to a steel
Yeah.
case.
Sure.
For what reason?
Last longer.
That's one, even though
Yeah.
it's steel, not stainless, or just,
It Depends on what kind of steel they're using, but it's not the old wrapped and riveted.
Okay.
I mean, I've had to kill some wells, to destroy some wells
Yeah.
that were artesian wells down on like the old Zanker Road landfill area or Owens Corning landfill. Where these are, it's steel plate that's been wrapped and riveted. And it's whatever they could find, and then it's butt welded together. So you have these segments, and sometimes it's a 1 foot piece that they found, and sometimes it's a 5 foot piece that they found. But they wrapped it, riveted, and then butt welded it together, and they spring leaks like you wouldn't believe. It wasn't good metal. But the steel casings that they're putting in, anything that they're putting in the ground that's a steel casing, typically is going to be good and last a while. And higher grade, and instead of the PVC just slotted casings, a lot of times for the steel, it's wire wrapped. And so it's beefier and it works better. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Yep. Yes.
In a lot of our regulations, we have the term wellhead.
Yep.
What is the
So there's
wellhead?
2 pieces. The
Okay.
wellhead is going to be what's sticking up. Could you go back one, please? This is what we're going to call the wellhead.
Okay, the whole
Okay.
piece.
Right. So it's the pad and it's the casing stick up, and then the piping coming off of that. So that's what we would look at as the wellhead. The other thing you may see in writing is a wellhead protection zone. That's what's happening around the well. So, what potential contaminating activities might we have that we want to protect against? And so sometimes there'll be, very large areas where they look at a wellhead protection study, and it's basically what might contaminate here.
Okay.
But that's the deal. Okay, go forward 2, please.
Greg, can I ask a quick question?
Sure, go
Is
for it.
there on that wellhead protection area, is there like a minimum distance out
No.
or not
No.
necessarily? Okay.
No. The closest thing that we're gonna have, go ahead and go one more. That's good. The closest, and I'll get to it in a minute, closest thing we're gonna have to that locally is, for us, is gonna be just our setbacks that are in our ordinance. Okay, or if it's a public supply well, there's a lot more, and I'll talk about that in a sec, but so locally, that would be just our setbacks. So that's sort of our wellhead protection program, is making sure we have adequate setbacks from different contaminating activities or setbacks that are related to property rights. Yeah.
And I got a question. Okay, the minimum sanitary seal for 20 feet, but earlier when Dante was mentioning of the well depth, and you said 10 feet or more. I know.
So if somebody is drilling a hole in the ground, a boring, say they're out there doing some geotechnical study to put a foundation in. If they're going 9 feet and that's all they're doing, they're not going to set a well or anything like that. They're going 9 feet, they don't have to permit that with that. Okay, but if they're going 10 feet or more, they do, even if they're not building a well, even if it's just a boring, right? But it's the sanitary seal is when you're constructing a well.
I get it. That was related.
Yep.
To 10 or more.
Yep. So we're the ones who permit the drilling and some of the follow-on work that may be required in environmental health. Now, either county or city planning and building are likely going to have other related pieces to that. It may be a development permit or a grading permit if you have to do significant grading to even get a pad in, a road and a pad to have a drill rig get in there to put the well in, or the plumbing or electrical that's going to be part of that. They're going to be getting in on that piece, or even a water storage tank. We don't permit the storage tank. That's planning and building. Ours is only the drilling of the well and then any follow-on. Now, very specifically from a planning point of view, in the coastal zone, LCP Doesn't say how many wells you can have within the coastal zone or anything along those lines, but it does require that you have either a CDP or a CDX, coastal development permit or coastal development exception, for us to issue a well drilling permit. Everything else about our well drilling permit theoretically is ministerial, as long as it meets everything in the ordinance, but we cannot start even reviewing that permit app until you have a CDP or a CDX. For most of your ag wells, as you know, that most of that's going to be CDX, that's the coastal development exemption. Anytime you're starting to put something in general for domestic use, now you've graduated to CDP. Is that right, Summer? I threw this in real quick because one of the things that scuttlebutt that came back to me is, I heard there's a well moratorium. There is no well moratorium. Except, number one, here in the city of Half Moon Bay, they have a moratorium on wells for single-family home development. Okay. Kind of weird because they don't have any water service connections either, but so in essence, that's a moratorium, but it really, that's a part of the CDP or CDX, because even in Half Moon Bay, they have an LCP. Pacifica, they have an LCP, right, a local coastal plan. So in those areas, I can only issue a permit if they say I can through a CDP or CDX. So that switch is on the local planning, right? But what we do have that came in last March is a state executive order. Go ahead and roll forward one, please. Now before we get to this, I think there was 3 or 4 pages to this order. And they all are the whereas and wherefores, and it's saying because of the drought, because of the overdraft of basins, everything else. We're going to be really careful about putting wells in. And most of that language of the requirements had to do with referring to the GSPs, the groundwater agencies, basically, that were formed for medium or high use or high risk basins, all the overdrafted basins. And so, you know, the Central Valley, everything else. But this does apply throughout the state. Item 9 of this order was the only one that really applies to us here in San Mateo County. And it's to protect health, safety, and environment, blah, 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 blah. A county, city, or other public agency shall not approve a permit for a new groundwater well or for alteration of existing well. Number 1, in a basin subject to the Sustainable Groundwater Act. We don't have any in our county. Okay. But B, we can't issue a permit for a new groundwater well or for alteration without first determining that extraction of groundwater from the proposed well is not likely to interfere with production and functioning of existing nearby wells. So no well-to-well interference, and not likely to cause subsidence that would adversely impact or danger nearby infrastructure. There's an out that this doesn't apply for permits for wells that will provide less than 2 acre feet. So translation on acre feet, you were throwing around 1,000 acre feet. 2 acre feet is roughly 652,000 gallons. So 652,000 gallons per year, which comes out to about 1,800 gallons a day. For groundwater, for individual domestic users. So ag wells are not exempt from it. But we take just about anything that will justify this. It doesn't take a huge engineering study. I've been really free with this partly because I'm a professional geologist, and I know that we really don't have an issue with subsidence in this county. That is, you know, something of the magnitude that would be likely here. And we have setbacks from well to well that have been shown to be pretty darn good. Yeah. Here's the other kicker here. This is not regulation. This isn't, it is, we'd like you to do this. There's no penalty for us not doing it. But we said we want to at least, see some justification. So we have pushed back on some ag wells, some irrigation wells, I should say, that were going in Woodside or some of the other areas. Where it was very large parcels and they were looking at using 3,000 or 4,000 gallons a day for their irrigation of their little miniature rainforest that they had created on their estate. So it's not regulation. It is a request of the local agency. And it doesn't take too much to justify this. Carrie?
On the interference, I'm very familiar with the fact that, like you say, we have setbacks from wells to wells and wells to property lines.
Yes.
So, for the most part, that seems to be adequate to deal with that issue. It sounds like unless there's,
In most areas of the county, absolutely.
okay, and so are there any specific areas more on the coast side here that we're more interested in on the, on the second item, on the substance, is there some area?
Subsidence? Or
That- that
subsidence,
more-
some
yeah.
people say.
Yeah, or,
No.
so there's, I mean,
We don't-
so we just individually, as we come in with an ag well, we'll just, and we'll just deal with Emily or you as far as making sure that,
They've been kicking them up to me because I'm signing off as geologist.
Yeah.
But yeah, it'll just kick up to me and you can pretty easily justify it. The subsidence really is mostly gonna happen where you have free unconsolidated sediments, right? The sands of the central basin. Our sediments are pretty consolidated. Our biggest problem is getting enough water, not, and getting it to flow fast enough. You know that, right? Yeah, Peter.
Speaking of setbacks, what's your setback from, repairing corridor?
There's a slide for that.
Okay, I'll wait there.
Go ahead and go forward one, please. So when you submit a permit application to us and it has the application completely filled out, all the fields and a map showing the well and any relevant setbacks on that map, preferably a base 10 scale map that is on surveyed topo because that helps a lot. We're going to be looking at that and then we're going to be setting something up, a site exam up with you to verify what we're seeing on paper in your application matches what we're seeing in the field. Of all the setbacks that come into question, because everything's laid out there currently is no setback from creeks or riparian corridor in our ordinance. But it'll likely be coming soon due to different lawsuits that have been going on in other parts of the state about groundwater surface water interaction. Now, Summer, do you have
Yes,
setbacks from
yes,
riparian
thank you,
corridor?
thank you. I was going to raise my hand. Yeah, so from the from a local coastal program standpoint, so land use, back to planning, we do have setbacks from creeks and from riparian corridors. So if it's an intermittent creek, then from the edge of riparian around that creek, it's I believe a 30-foot setback. And if it's a perennial creek, it's 50 foot from the edge of riparian. If there's no and so that's for any development, including wells. We consider wells to be development in the coastal zone. So 30 or 50 feet from edge of riparian corridor that has been delineated by a biologist. If there's no riparian corridor, then it's 30 or 50 feet from, I think it's the center line of the creek. I don't have it on hand, but I believe from the center line of the creek then 30 or 50 feet. So it just moves inward if there's no riparian as determined by a qualified biologist.
So most of my setbacks are either property rights or they are public health setbacks. And the riparian corridor really is, I'll call it an environmental setback. And my staff aren't gonna go and judge where the edge of that riparian corridor is or anything like that. That's why we have been leaving that one up to planning. Yep,
Great, back to the executive order.
yes.
On some of our larger agricultural operations, where maybe they were anticipating that they would get a high producing well, would then that trigger some other metering or for you to make sure that they're within that 1,800 gallons a
No,
day, or
because that doesn't apply to them. Because the 1,800 gallons a day
it's just for domestic?
is for domestic use.
That's a lot of water.
Yeah.
Well, that's about right for a single family home.
Yeah.
And they're spending most of that for water in their yard.
Yeah.
But that's about right. Ask our plumber, and the guy who puts all that stuff in. Let me go to Peter first.
Back of the setbacks. And I know, it doesn't fall in your part, but as far as repairing corridor, it falls more in summer, so maybe she can listen. Where, and I mainly mentioned about in the watershed of San Gabriel, where a lot of the property owners have water rights and that they have year-round water rights. I don't understand where a property owner has applicable year-round water rights, why there's gotta be a corridor setback, seeing that they have water rights. And so if in fact, if it is proven that it's a take from the creek, but they have well in with their water rights, why can it be?
I'm guessing that the lawyers would guess that they're double dipping. They're pulling from the creek and they're pulling from a well that is within that riparian corridor that could have groundwater surface water interaction. That could be depleting the creek when of water that they're taking in addition to those rights.
Yes,
Now,
but
if they want to have a well placed as a diversion rather than, in lieu of a diversion, then within the riparian corridor, correct me if I'm wrong, Summer, you'd have to go through Fish and Wildlife, Fish and Game, or whatever they're calling themselves these days.
Right, Fish and Wildlife.
Fish and Wildlife as a creek diversion if you're within that area. Then it simply shifts to those water rights. And it's a matter of who has jurisdiction for doing work within that riparian corridor. And that would be Fish and Wildlife.
My point is that I don't see why it's not permissible in the fact that if a person has the water rights to pump year round, and it's, some people have 2,000, 3,000 gallons a day, and with their incidental water rights to the farming that is used for household use as well, and therefore, and they do have a water master for San Gregorio,
Right.
and I don't see why a person that wanted to drill a domestic well, and if they have applicable amount of water rights to cover it, they have to have this setback, where if they drill by the creek, and if the water master wants to deem it as within their water rights, you just put a meter on it, and they're not.
So
going
that's a
beyond.
potential, but again, that's, as you said, if the water master wants to allow that and then work with planning and work with Fish and Wildlife to get that in, because then the water master is going to have to enter that in their inventory. Who is it now? Stetson Engineering still?
Yes,
Yes,
that's,
definitely.
So again, you may be able to do it, but it's going to take a variance and it's going to take buy-off from several agencies and their lawyers.
when I raised this question at an ag advisory meeting years ago, when Rob Bertoli was our representative here, he said, well, that's our ruling, one sets all, and that's it. He didn't give any.
Yeah, that I don't know. Summer, is it something that could get a variance with concurrence of Fish and Wildlife and the water and Stetson Engineering, say, for the San Gregorio watershed?
And that's to install a well within a riparian? Is
Correct.
that the question? I'm looking in here. I do not think No, I don't believe so. We have certain allowed uses within riparian corridors outlined in our local coastal program, as well as permitted uses or conditionally permitted uses within buffer zones. So not the riparian itself, but the buffer zone from the riparian. And I just scanning through, I don't think possibly within a buffer zone. Pipelines are maybe permittable in a riparian corridor. Pipelines to water, but not a well itself. So I agree with the past determination. I don't think we have anything in our local coastal program that would allow us to support a well that is within a riparian, possibly within a buffer.
No, I was talking about with the buffer, not right in the riparian. Because,
Oh.
so say if the setback is 50 feet and when the Blue House had to drill their well and they had to, their setback was more than 50 feet to be in compliance with your rules and regulations. That really baffled me because I know he has similar water rights that I do. This is not only that they have the water rights in the creek, but he has water rights to store with his reservoir. And I know he incidental water rights, incidental to the farm for year round. So therefore that he could, I didn't understand why he couldn't drill closer.
Was it for domestic or for ag?
It was for domestic.
It was combined
Domestic.
domestic and ag.
It was
Okay.
for-
Okay.
Domestic.
Yeah, so if it's,
On that one?
yeah, so if you're combining, so ag, there's a separate, we have a separate coastal development. Greg has mentioned this, we have a separate coastal development permit exemption. And there's certain criteria that need to be met in order to qualify for that exemption. And for those, we don't even really open, we don't open, it's an exemption. So we don't open the local coastal program because it's exempt. For domestic, it's different because domestic is not a principally permitted use in PAD zoning, ag is. So that's why it's a little more lenient for ag wells versus domestic wells. And when you're doing domestic and ag kind of combined, it's still, we take the more kind of, I guess, conservative approach. And it's, if you've got domestic and well use for the well water use, it's domestic for purposes of applying our regulations. If it's one well and you're using it for both, it's got to meet the more strict standards of domestic. So that would be, so within riparian buffer zones, we do have an allowance. You've got to go through a coastal development permit, and it's fully appealable to the Coastal Commission, but you can put residential development. It has to be at least 20 feet from any limit of riparian vegetation, provided no alternative feasible location exists on the property. You may seek a kind of an exception through the coastal development permit process for something like that. But it's again got to meet those criteria. There's no other, feasible alternative location on the site. And it still has to meet a 20-foot minimum, and it's a discretionary permit. So it's, it goes up to the Planning Commission and is appealable to the Coastal Commission.
Carrie and then.
And that just, in the coastal zone, that appeal zone for the coastal commission is 100 feet. So
Yes,
even
that's
though-
correct.
So you're, when you're from the center line of the creek, so you can still be okay, but meeting the rules of the county from your 50-foot setback, but then you're still, they don't have the coastal commission takes a look at these wells too, because their primary concern is protection of coastal resources, and that includes water. So you don't really, the county is really great to work with, but the coastal commission, you want to avoid that. Just trust me, you want to avoid that.
Yeah, where we have, applied that that policy of being closer than the, within the buffer zone. It's on, it's not kind of a loose policy that we, that people can use. We look at that very strictly, and, where I've seen it occur are properties where, a majority of the property is encumbered by riparian. And there's one little, small pocket for development purposes, or, there has to be some, good argument in case made with regards to the criteria that there's, no feasible alternative exists to locate it somewhere else.
And then Dante,
Thank you. Do you see this changing anytime soon? How long is this good for? Will you come to us before things change?
which part?
Just the whole presentation about just everything that you're presenting here tonight.
I don't know when the state's executive order might be rescinded or changed or upgraded in any way or anything along that. As I said here, when it comes to setbacks from creeks, that may be pushed down. A group from the California Department of Water Resources and the California, was it basically the CCDH, it's the Directors of Environmental Health for all the counties, are working on new state well standards. We're hoping to see them out within a year, or at least go for comment within a year. They may incorporate something, but the last technical advisory committee for that I sat in on, they were not. They're still waiting for a lot of the lawsuits to shake out.
And then maybe you're gonna cover it here, the quantity and quality required for domestic. Do you see that changing?
No. We built in a lot of different pieces to that I'll talk about in a minute. Go ahead.
Yeah, wasn't finished.
Sorry.
That's correct. Is because here, and I've given examples. Like when Ryan went to have his well drilled in the Blue House, he had to be further than 50-foot setback. And I was confused why he had to be that far back when he had the water rights to back him up if it proven that he was taking creek water. Where later in a date, it came across our committee where the property owner of 5 acres applied for a well that was near a creek. And I asked our county representative of our committee, what steps is the county going to take to have it tested or whatnot needed to prove that it would be proven that he's not drawing from the creek, seeing he has no water rights, then that was overlooked. And here you had a ranch of over 80 acres with water rights to support that, and he couldn't drill near the creek where a person that had in the same watershed less than 5 acres that was drilling near the creek and with no water rights and no safeguard was set front and for us. And I was asking for support for our county representative on our board, and this was a few years back, we did not get it.
I'm not familiar with the case. I really don't know
No, I know.
what happened there.
And then this is more to the summer.
Yeah.
So I don't understand why one with over 200,000 gallons a day of water rights, I says had to be far away, and one with no water rights could drill near the creek, have a 5-acre parcel. And I asked what's steps is the county going to set for to be tested that they won't be a take from the creek. And I was blown off.
And the little more background, the problem is like the current well and the wells we're poking around trying to find water. We're not finding water. What we did find was hardly any water, and it's horrible water. So some of what Peter's getting to is the better water would have been the
Right next to
those riparian.
yeah, the better
So
water.
it's an ongoing thing. I
Right,
see a
right.
lot of money to You know, my water for all these houses.
Water for Blue House, he's been into the creeks, and he had all the water rights to support that. And then you have another case a few years later that came across our board that has 5 acres to put in a domestic well that has no water rights. And it's okay if he's near the creek. I don't get the gist of that.
So is the takeaway, don't get water rights because they don't matter?
And I asked the logical question, what's the county gonna set forth that it is tested, that it's not a take from the creek, seeing that this parcel has no water rights? Well, that's not our part, that's not, so I went a step further. I called the water master and he said, funny. He said, a judge asked me the same question years ago. And I also had this conversation with environmental well, and he mentioned your name years ago, Alan Richardson. And that's when you get divided, at least you had a letter stated that, however, that if you do drill near the creek and it's proven that it's a take, you need water rights. And that's how
And that was,
came about.
that was probably, what was his name? The guy right up by, on the other side of the bridge from, where's my brain? Up by Cuesta. No, up in La Honda, but no, outside of the coastal zone. I can't remember his name, right by Church of the Redwoods. Anyway, he fought that and went up.
Pinger.
Pinger, there you go.
Yeah, that was bad.
That was a mess.
I don't know how that one got permitted almost.
So
Well, and part of that was to fit both the septic system and a well on the property. So I don't know.
So yeah, our setbacks for the local coastal program, our setbacks are from riparian corridors are they're not specific to wells. So our local coastal program unfortunately does not consider specific setbacks for wells or well development separate from any other sort of development, which is a very broad definition in terms of applying our local coastal program. So wells are considered development and development has a setback from riparian corridors for the purposes of protecting those corridors and riparian areas because they're considered sensitive habitat for whatever values that they have, whether it's the vegetation or habitat, wildlife that lives in that vegetation. But unfortunately, like I said, our LCP doesn't consider specifically wells and whether they have water rights already, a property has water rights already or not. It's just not that specific. So the setback applies for any development, those 30 and 50-foot setbacks. It's more broad based, unfortunately.
Well, my point is, Summer, is I was just pretty much confused when a person had a lot of water rights. They had to be more than 50 feet from the riparian corridor, and a person had no water rights in a real small parcel, and he could be real close to the creek. And then so I went a step further through the committee, asked, I says, what provisions is San Mateo County and steps are going to step forth to make sure this person's not taking water from the creek, but having no water rights. And it wasn't you, Summers, the lady before you said, well, we don't get into that.
Yeah.
That was the answer.
Peter, I think.
Yeah.
Made your point,
Yeah.
pretty clearly. I guess in this case, it would be great if there was a way to have an exemption, like say this specific instance where someone's trying to provide good water for a housing development and has rights to the creek anyways, can I just get the 10 gallons a day that I need, or 10 gallons a minute rather, that I need for these 4 units because I actually have the right to pump, 300 gallons a minute or whatever. But I don't know that you can really, the regulations aren't written to apply to one specific case, even as much as it may make sense to us in this particular instance.
Shall we move on? So we permit the drilling of the well. Once we've got the well in, it's constructed for its intended use. Then we look at what the follow-on pieces are. If it's an agricultural or irrigation well, there really is no follow-on. You get your permit, set the pump, you get the permit for the electrical, the storage, whatever you need there. There is no pump test required, so there is no requirement for a certain production. It's your ag well, okay? And nothing about end-use water quality. That's up to you, how you want to deal with that. Now, when we come to domestic, again, that would be for 1 to 4 service connections. Typically, we're seeing it for a single-family home. They need to have, there's a production requirement, so they have to do a pump test. There's basically the standard pump test that's carried in our ordinance, and then there's a specialty piece that says if you're in the urbanized mid-coast, then there's a little bit more of a requirement to have it observed, the pump test observed by a geologist or engineer, and then they have to look at the recovery of the well, because frankly, we had some well drillers back in the day who were drilling really deep wells and trying to drill them bigger diameter just so that they could have a whole bunch of water in storage in the well. So the well wasn't producing that much water. It was like it was producing a little, but you had a tank. And so they would pump it down a couple 100 feet and call that the pump test done, because for the 4 hours, they were able to get 2.5 gallons a minute. But the well was almost dry when they finished, and it took 2 days to recover. That's not production. So they got, especially in the mid coast, really started looking at a recovery test. Okay, and so that was, I think before I took this position in 2007, that was one of my pieces of input that I had to give to the ordinance. That tells you how old this ordinance is. So domestic wells, look at water quality and water quantity. We look at water quality first when the well is drilled and they do the pump test, and then we collect a sample. So we're looking at the raw water, then spec out what kind of treatment needs to go on it. Treatment gets put in along with building of the home. And then once that's done, to give the home, for us to sign off on the final for the building permit, they've got to show us a post-treatment sample that meets all the Title 22 primary drinking water standards and secondary drinking water standards, mainly because our 2 biggest problems we see here on the coast from water quality are iron and manganese. Okay, and with the iron, when you go to use that for your laundry, we still see that with a lot of springs out there. You go to do it with your laundry and you're going to get black streaks on that white t-shirt. You can do the manganese and, I'm getting it wrong. Sorry, the orange from the iron. Your white t-shirts turn orange, especially when you add bleach, just makes it worse. Because it changes it brings the iron out, right? And then for the manganese, you get the black streaks. But it's the secondary are basically taste and odor. They're not a health-based goal. Manganese can be if it's 10 times the limit. And they're actually coming out with a stricter limit for manganese because of the health-based goals on it. That'll probably come out within the next year, I believe. And then public supply wells. So the domestic wells, once you've certified it as a domestic source, we walk away. It's up to you. Remember, I told you that all the water is based on risk. So for a single family home or for up to 4 homes, it's considered low risk. So we certify it to make sure that it can be good quality and enough quantity. And then we step away and it's the well owner's responsibility. Okay. You go a step up. If it's 5 to 14 service connections, a little bit more, that's called a state small water system. That's a misnomer because the state can never regulate it. Only the health officer, county health officer can regulate it. So that comes to us. We have about a dozen state small water systems that we regulate. That's a little bit more, heck, you can even serve creek water as long as you have continuous chlorination under that. Now, sometimes people want to stay away from being a state small, especially farms that may get, 5, housing units on them. It actually can be better to be a state small. Number one, limit your liability because you have more people looking at what's happening there for the water being served. So you limit your liability with people who are living in those homes. Number two, we don't have to rely on that. If it's 4 distinct homes, not small enough to be considered an accessory dwelling unit, then we have to look at 2.5 gallons a minute per home. Once you get to be a state small, we can throw that out the window. We can do some trade-off. I mean, we want to get enough water to make it feasible, but we can do a trade-off and have more water in storage versus less production. Okay. And our annual fee is not that much for that. Yeah.
On that trade-off you just said, so if a guy had a 2 gallon a minute, would that mean that Jenny said, I'm willing to put in 100,000 gallon storage, I got 2 gallons a minute, 24/7.
Yeah, we're talking at 5 to 14 service connections. So if you had 2 gallons a minute per unit, yeah, I don't have to stick to the 2.5 gallons a
So
minute.
there is a little. bit
So,
of
yeah,
flexibility
but
there.
we still want to have adequate water, right? But sometimes it's better to be that state small. But then when you graduate up to a public water supply, like Marquis Central Farm, like some of the others where you've got enough people there. I won't get into why it's back at the state. We used to regulate up to 199 service connections. We gave that back to the state because we couldn't do it for the price.
So PSA 11, sorry, Steve and I had the conversation on the way up. That was your choice to give that up, correct? It wasn't.
All
mandatory.
30 of the public water systems, we actually looked at it. We took it to the, which committee was it? The Board of Supervisors Environmental Quality Committee. Back in 2010, am I getting that right?
Yeah.
Because for what we could charge, we could not do that program. And we were being basically, we were still regulated by the state Division of Drinking Water for us to do that program. And they weren't going to let us continue unless all of those systems were brought up to a higher standard. And we couldn't do it we basically took a poll of all the water systems that we were doing, and they said, no, we'd rather pay less money. And so we had to give it over to the state. There was a big meeting for the Environmental Quality Committee. We had quite a few people there. That's why I was looking at Steve because I remember him sitting there and we were talking. And so that went back to the Division of Drinking Water. I think back then it was still California Department of Public Health. But now it's State Water Resource Control Board, just different cost center basically of the state. So if you're going to do for a public system, different well construct, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm confused that it sounds like there's maybe a 4th level because you said there's 1 to 4. Service
I didn't
connections,
put in,
5 to 14,
so this is 1 to 4.
and
In
then-
between what I didn't put was that state small water system, the well requirements would be the same as domestic for the well construction. But then there's production, that we can look at production and that kind of stuff.
Right, but I thought you defined a community water system or a public water system as 25 or more.
Correct.
people.
So
it doesn't.
sorry, 15 or more service connections or 25 or more people.
Okay,
Sorry.
the service connections is 15.
So it's kind of weird. Domestic wells in our ordinance, it says 1 to 4 service connections. It doesn't say how many people.
You're gonna be okay, John.
Yeah.
5 to 14 service connections is a state small water system that we regulate. And then 15 or more service connections or 25 or more people. And then there's different levels of that.
And so with the 5 to 14, you can get you're saying that you can even use surface water so long as it's got constant.
If you have the rights to it and that kind of stuff, yes,
Yeah.
we would want to see it appropriately filtered. I mean, we use We use what's basically surface water, spring water, from the two springs out at,
Pomponia?
well, Pomponia, we have the springs, we also have, but that's not a state small yet. Talking to Chris about that one. What's the other one that we had? Oh, the Jurassic
Oh, yes.
Resident Artist
They're on-
Community.
Well, it's a horizontal.
It's a horizontal well, which is a spring. And yeah, so we want to see adequate treatment. We're still looking at all that in the water quality, but we're gonna look more at disinfection there because there's more people potentially affected.
Right. And is that also true when you get up to the above 15 or more?
Yeah, when you get to the public supply. So number one, harder to create a new public water system. I say public just because that's what the definition calls it.
Mhm.
So you go into the state here. You got to do their pump test. It's a whole different pump test that you run that is based on the waterworks standards. A whole lot more water quality that you're looking at. A D-swap, that's a source water area protection. So that's kind of in lieu of the setbacks, you're having to look at the potentially contaminated activities within the sphere of influence of that source, which could be pretty big when you're talking about a public water system.
And that
if-
kicks in at how many people are?
That kicks in at
connections.
15 or more service connections or
Okay.
25 or more of the same people on a regular basis.
Thank you.
You have to have a full engineering report. You have to, I mean, it's a 2 to 3 year process for a public water system. Yeah. And you got in the kind of the back door on that one because it started with us and then it pushed over to them. Right. Now, when you have a well, let's say you put it in as an ag well, it can be converted to a domestic well or to some other well, as long as the construction is appropriate. In other words, we're having a big, we've had an issue for the past several years of wells that were put in at more of a domestic well construction. And they've been being used for a state regulated public water system. They don't like it. It doesn't meet their construction standards. So they push saying if it's too short of a seal, sanitary seal, oh, that's groundwater under the direct influence of surface water. And instead of treating it like a well, we're going to treat it like it's a creek source. Expensive treatment. But you can convert a well from ag to domestic as long as if it needs to get a CDP, then you'd have to go through that CDP process to convert, because we need the CDP to show it as domestic versus maybe you put it in as ag with a CDX. But you can convert wells. We took an ag well to a domestic well that then became used as a state small water system at Cascade Ranch.
Yeah.
If you're looking for a driller, we have a list of drillers. It's not recommendations, a list of drillers who say they do work in our county. Ask your friends, because there are some drillers who are good and some drillers who are not so good. So ask people you trust about drillers. Next slide, please. Sorry, go.
On the conversion of the wells, do
Yeah.
you see that ending anytime soon? Meaning, let's say, okay, somebody said.
It's really just a matter of how it's classified and how, did it need some other additional permit, like a CDP or CDX?
So you're sitting on an ag well, 50-foot seal. Some days it's such a good ag well, you might use it for domestic, but why would you pay for a CDP now versus make it part of the bigger CDP for development someday?
You can do that. That's the
Yeah,
whole
so the
thing.
clock's
Usually it's
usually
because
something-
somebody's gonna develop and they're gonna put a home in and they're gonna use that well. They've already got the well, but it was permitted as an ag well.
Mhm.
Didn't go through the CDP process, but when they do the home, then yeah, you write it, as Carrie, we've done them before. You write it into the CDP when you do that.
And we would hear well in
We had
advance
David
that they were.
Stewart.
gonna put the kibosh.
It's based on the well construction and whether it can be, it can be used for domestic, right?
Well, one of the things that we've had a little difficulty with some of the older ones that were drilled you know, with the proper seal and everything, being able to document it, to find.
Yeah.
That particular
Existing old
log.
Was there a well log for that particular well and we couldn't tell?
Yeah.
And even maybe it was a steel well, so you couldn't tell by a neutron log where the,
Right.
you know, because we've allowed that. I've
Yeah.
seen that
Oh,
on
yeah.
some wells where, you know, brought Wilenko in or somebody to
Yeah.
do geophysical and do a neutron log. Neutron density log shows, you know, what the density of the material next to the well casing is, and you can usually see where the well seal is.
Yeah.
And so we've allowed, you know, different lines of evidence. So all of this has a fee, right? We break them into phases because you may put the well in and maybe it's not going to produce enough, so you put the well in and then you find it's not making enough, so why do the pump test, right? Because the driller's going to tell you, oh, we didn't put that much.
Yeah.
So we do it in phases, but typically we start at the planning app review, right? In most cases, because if it has to go through planning app review, we get in on that floor, so we can try to see how it integrates with whatever else is happening. If it's simply a CDP or CDX for just a well, if it's a CDP and it's for a home and that kind of stuff, yeah, we're going to charge our fees because we're having to do a lot of review there. If it's a CDX for an ag well, typically we waive that because we're not really doing that much. As long as we see it meets setbacks, then we let it come through to our permit process. The well drilling fee, simply for siting, drilling that well, building the well. Pump test actually goes through quite a bit to do the pump test. And then permit to operate as domestic source. That's reviewing the quality. Basically, we're looking at the sample of raw water, the sample after treatment. So sometimes it's a couple of different rounds and looking at the treatment. And then that also includes us going out to see that, yes, you have the wellhead constructed properly, that everything is done there, that, you know, we don't permit the tank, but you have appropriate storage, all the different pieces related to that. And then well destruction. One of the things that we go back on and we see older wells is they were put in without thought of how they were going to be destroyed eventually. Every well will need to be destroyed eventually, proper destruction or abandonment. Probably the first thing that I was taught back in the 80s of before you put a well in, know how you're going to destroy it in the long run. The fees that I'm showing, this is our current fee. These have been the same fees for the last 7 years. Right? Board of Supervisors didn't want us to raise them. We held them down, and then we went and before COVID, we had done an entire fee study for environmental health. We hired a company that specializes in it, and we looked at all of our fees. We looked at all of our past time tracking for everything we do, and presented that. And then they put it off again and again. July 1, it was voted on by the Board of Soups several months ago. These are where the fees are going to be. And yes, one did go down.
Okay, I thought it was a typo.
It's not a typo. So as part of what we did in evaluating the fees is we looked at how many hours we think we spend on these. We looked at how many hours we did actually book against these, because we track everything by project. It gets a service request number. We put our time to that as we're working on them. I usually don't get to put my time to it, but I usually only get to it when it's a problem, right? One of the things that we saw, so the planning app review used to be the exact same number as the building application review. And when we looked at it, I can't remember, I think it was, we were spending more on the building app, no, more on the building app review than the planning app review. So the building app went up, I think, another hour or two more. The other thing that happened here is our hourly that was figured by the outside company and all the bean counters went from $198 an hour to $246 an hour. That's where most of this comes in, the increase. because we hadn't touched this in 7 years. We didn't get our cost of living increase. So well destruction. Like I said, every well that is put in will eventually need to be properly destroyed so that it is not a continued potential pathway to the subsurface for contaminants. Next slide. So destroying older wells. This is straight from the California well standards. And you see, it's not just because we want to get rid of a liability, it's because it can be a pathway for pollutants, it can pose a public health and safety threat. There's all kinds of reasons for destroying those old wells. We don't want them there. Unfortunately, it's one of the things that we do not have a very good database in this county of all the wells. We have a lot of very old wells that are just unknown and unaccounted for. And kind of like when planning and building, when their files got destroyed by basement flooding out at one point, we have records that, you know, they were handwritten records that were in folders, and we tried to digitize everything, but there's stuff that just, you know, happened before we had those records. So we don't have a lot of that, but we are trying to keep track of what we have when we see it. If it's not being, it's in our ordinance and in the state well standard. If a well is not being used for its intended purpose for at least 1 year, it's supposed to be properly abandoned or destroyed. Now, we have a lot of wells out there that would fit that category. And there's a lot that we may be coming back around on, but not this instant. But we're trying to make sure that nothing is a big threat. In this county, based on the well construction, pressure grouting is the most common method of destruction. There's not a whole lot of times where you have to actually go in and get a drill rig out there again and drill out the well. We see that more on some unconstructed monitoring wells and such, but most of it is pressure grouting, or if it's sometimes if it's an odd construction, it may require explosives. We just had one that was done up in Moss Beach, right off Sunshine Canyon Road, right where it bridges off of what's the cross street there?
Off Sunshine Valley.
Sunshine Valley, where it starts toward the coast. Anyway,
Oh, Etheldor.
Etheldor, so near the corner of Etheldor and Sunshine Valley. The well had a funky construction where we had sand up behind blank. So we talked before about a well bore that came down and they put in perforated casing down here, and then blank casing, and then more perforated casing, and then blank casing up to the surface. And unfortunately, what they did was they put a sanitary seal up here for just this portion, the 20 feet up here. And this was all sandpacked. So that is a very good potential route for migration of contaminants, especially because we have all this sand that if you pressure grout, you're only going to get grout up to about here in that sand. So you still have a big void potential there where it can be additional flow down. So they come in, they hang typically PVC, light PVC with explosives every so many feet, little shaped chargers. Then they fill it with grout, with the cement, sand and cement grout. Put some over the top, weight it down really good so it doesn't go blowing off somewhere. Usually that'll be a drill rig, and they'll sit the Kelly head of the drill rig right on it, so all the weight of the drill rig is there. They set off the explosives, it perfs, it basically blows out all of this, and the grout can fill all of that, and then you top the grout off. So well destruction, now it's done. Next slide. Financial assistance. There is some financial assistance out there when it comes to wells. Number one, if you're putting in a well for domestic supply, or if it's however, or even if it's going to be a public supply well that is for farm worker housing, all of our fees, all of planning and building fees are waived. If it's related to farm worker housing or farm labor housing, as we used to call it, or employee housing. So that goes back to, I can't remember what year, but there's a little typewritten, not even computer generated resolution that I have my copy of that the Board of Supervisors put in. So any one-time fees related to planning and building related to farm labor housing, including environmental health fees. So if you're drilling the well, we still, you have to permit it through us, but we don't charge the fee. If you're doing the pump test, same thing, we don't charge the fee. Work still has to be done through us. That does not include any ongoing annual fees, like if it's a state small water system, you're still gonna have to pay if it's going to $1,500 or $1,600 a year for that, something along those lines. Through the State Water Resources Control Board, if you put in your Google search engine or whatever, Bing or whatever you like to use, put in SWRCD and either funding or financial assistance, there are pages and pages of where you can get either low-cost loans, no-cost loans, grants, you name it, for lots of different things, especially related to water, that have come down through the state. They have, I think, $2 or $3 million easily that they're trying to give away that they're not getting takers on. So it's a good place to go look, especially in disadvantaged community areas. Questions? Carrie.
Not question, I just really want to thank you for a very comprehensive presentation and really so thoroughly explained. I think it really helps a lot of people. I work in this realm a lot, but on another note, I mean, you have been so responsive for people in need. I've worked with you on so many emergency permits and people in dire straits, not only for water, but also with septic, because you have helped for the environment and for the individuals that have bad circumstances, and we just really appreciate on the both sides.
Thanks. Appreciate it. My deal is, I don't want people to look at environmental health, and especially my land use group or any of my other groups, and say, oh, they're a roadblock.
Right.
We want to, sometimes it takes a while, but we want to find solutions. We want to get it done. That's our goal. So, Mr. Silvestri.
Only one red flag.
Yes, sir.
Is you said something about retirement. That's concerning. It's very concerning.
Well, I'm still covered under the union agreement of AFSCME, you know, I'm not managed, no. And so my union sold me out in the most recent round of negotiations when it came to retirement medical. And so I'm hoping I can still retire. My goal has always been roughly 2 years from now, maybe 3. I'm trying to groom good people. You know them.
We got projects and we got land up. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, thanks, Greg, for
Yeah.
coming.
And
I'm
I
sorry it's
too long, I know, I just.
You're only slightly later than I was. So I think I'm the one to be blamed. But unless there's some other announcements from Summer, probably.
I did just want to real quick, and thanks Greg for the great presentation, and I'm gonna take your slides and I'll post them online as well.
Please do. Please do.
And there was one thing on the director's report I just wanted to close the loop on that I wanted to mention, going back to the Thompson Baker project that that the Ag Advisory Committee heard at the last meeting in March. They did provide, I just wanted to draw your attention, it's listed in the director's report, but under other projects A, they did provide an updated grazing utilization map, and that has been included as an attachment to the director's report that does demonstrate that the property utilizes over 91% of the property for grazing. There was a question about whether they complied with the 75% land grazing utilization requirement of the Land Conservation Act. And they do, and that information can be found as an attachment to the director's report. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Summer. That's good. We wanted that information.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks, everyone. Again, sorry, I was a few minutes late, and we'll adjourn until next time.
Thank you, Summer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah, no problem.
Bye-bye.
Bye.